Sometime in the 1940s, an eerie signal was picked up by a nearby American ship. The strange message was one of distress, and after finding the ship that sent it, the whole crew was discovered to be dead. To make matters worse, a surprise explosion caused the mystery ship to sink to the bottom of the sea. Many people have tried over the years to claim they know the truth, with some people going as far to say it's a ghost ship. Join me as we talk about the USS Ourang Medan. Welcome to the world of the arcane. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Arcane Archives podcast. I am very excited to be talking about the USS Ourang Medan with you today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to listen to it. And if you wouldn't mind taking a tiny bit more time, feel free to rate the podcast, subscribe, follow, whatever it may be on the platform that you're listening to. Especially if you're on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and comment. We want that algorithm up and running over there, so feel free to do that. Wanted to give a quick sneak peek for next week's episode. We will be talking about a secret society. This is something that I have yet to talk about on the podcast, so we're going to pave the way for that next week. And I may have a special guest. We'll see if she's okay with doing it, but figured I'd throw in a little sneak peek before we get started. With all that being said, let's dive back into the world of the unsolved mysteries with the mystery of the USS Ourang Medan. As we start with the history of this ship, there are a couple of things that I want you to take note of. This is seriously lacking in the information department of the history of this ship, and so people have naturally filled in the holes, for better or for worse. I'm going to try to keep things organized for this episode, but please be aware that there may be things that I might give different information, conflicting information on, so keep that in mind. The USS Ourang Medan was supposedly built in the 1910s, with some sources specifying it to be the year 1918. This ship was a part of the Dutch East Indies, which is now known as Indonesia, and was used for transporting goods. With its purpose being that of shipping, it most likely focused on the shipment of things such as spices, wood, and pretty much anything related to those two things. These were typical common things transported between Europe and that Indonesian area during this time. The specific time that this whole event happened is also unknown. Basically, every source that I read says it happened in the 1940s, late 1940s, around that time, roughly 20 years after the ship had first been constructed. The ship was reportedly going through what is known as the Strait of Malacca. This strait goes between the country of Malaysia and one of the Indonesian islands. Basically, if you look at a map, it's a little northwest of Singapore. A nearby American ship called the Silver Star caught the distress signal. I couldn't find too much on the Silver Star ship, so I'm not confident in saying that it was part of the United States military, but from what I found, it was a part of another shipping company, but it was still American owned. So they hear this distress signal, and this is what the distress signal says. Quote, "We float. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room and on the bridge. Possibly a whole of crew dead. I die." End quote. And this was the final message sent out and that others received from the SS Ourang Medan. Of course, the American Silver Star ship promptly changed its directions and started heading towards the distress signal. When the boat arrived, it quickly became apparent that this was a very uneasy situation. They boarded the ship and they discovered that not a single soul on the boat was alive. Every single person was dead. Bodies that belonged to the Ourang Medan were littered across the ship's deck, There was no SOS survivor that was alive to greet them, assuming that whoever sent that SOS signal was still on the boat. Their bodies were quite cruel and confusing. They were described as having, quote, teeth bared, with their upturned faces to the sun, staring as if in fear, end quote. Some reports state that their limbs were stiff, with some having their arms out as if they were trying to grab something. Almost all of their eyes were open and showed signs of what can only be described as terror or fear, and as I mentioned, they were staring out into the sun in some situations. Even the dog that was living on the ship at the time was found dead, and it appears to have died mid-snarl, potentially alluding to a threat. Even with all of these dead sailors and the dead dog, none of them appeared to have had any external injuries, or injuries that at least the people who boarded the ship could see. The exploration of the rest of the ship didn't raise any other alarms, except for the fact that everyone on the ship was dead. But regardless of that, the captain of the Silver Star decided that it would be best if their ship attached and started towing the boat. I couldn't find exactly where their intended towing destination was, but that really doesn't matter, and you'll see why in a second. So during the initial process of this towing, there was a fire that had been discovered, and it just engulfed the Ourang Medan. By my guess, the fire must have taken a while to be detected, and thus it could have spread, or it was really intense and it was difficult to extinguish. And because of this, there was a catastrophic explosion that was so big that some people report that the ship leaped out of the water for a brief moment, slammed back down, and it just quickly sank to the bottom of the ocean. Now, from what I read and studied, from the time of hearing the distress call to getting to the ship and all the stuff that I just mentioned, this was in the span of a couple of hours, probably just in a day. This wasn't like a long, week-long process. This all happened in like one day. So this is pretty intense. And as you can probably guess, the potentially random explosion will play a plentiful part in all the theories later on. Now, with the boat being at the bottom of the ocean, the Silver Star, well, surprisingly couldn't really do much. And so that continued on, and any more information that we had regarding the Ourang Medan is sitting at the bottom of the ocean, and it really only leaves us with two questions. Question 1, what happened to the crew, and how did they meet their unfortunate demise? Question 2, what caused the explosion that led to the ship's unfortunate demise? So there are theories for this mystery that range pretty far and wide. I'm going to save till the end what I think is the most interesting one, and then I'll throw in my own thoughts. There was a supposed survivor of this ship named Jerry Rabbit. Jerry had supposedly joined up with the crew in Shanghai. He said that right before the ship had taken off from the port, there were about 15,000 unknown crates that were loaded up into this boat. It was there that he realized that this boat might actually be involved in smuggling. And so the ship set sail, and after a couple of crew members became sick, and one of them actually eventually dying, Jerry grew suspicious of what had been loaded onto the ship back in Shanghai. He looked around and he discovered that the crates were holding some sort of mixture of nitroglycerin, sulfuric acid, and potassium cyanide, which is quite a deadly toxic soup. So he suspected that these crates had been leaking toxic gases, and that's what was causing all these different effects to these crew members. Eventually, it got to a point where Rabbit and a couple of others decided to abandon the ship entirely, get onto a little raft boat, and leave everyone else to their own demise. So they were stranded at sea. All the other members on this raft died. Rabbit was the only survivor, and so he was eventually found, and he died a couple of days later, but he did have the chance to share his story with the people that found him. And a quick side note that I'll throw in here, I described where this strait was located in terms of like on a map. I was concerned that he would have been stuck at sea for a long time. The distance between islands, or how close you are to land is actually really, really close. So, we always think about being stranded in the ocean, like the middle of the Pacific. That's not true. He was really close to land, and so it makes sense that if this theory is correct, he would have been picked up really quickly. So assuming that this story is credible, this would answer a lot of questions like why the crew was killed, why there was little to no injury on the outside of their bodies, and of course the secret material that was being shipped is a perfect recipe for a massive explosion, which sadly, of course, there are no bodies to examine, there's no autopsies that can be performed, everything else is at the bottom of the ocean, so this can only ever stay a theory, most likely. But as I said at the beginning, this one answers a lot of questions. So Rabbit could have been the person that sent out the distress signal, which explains why the signal was sent, but then everyone's dead. There's still a little bit of questions because it could have been him, but he doesn't claim to have sent the SOS signal. Maybe he forgot to say that. Maybe he didn't think it was important. Kind of a tug of war with answers to questions, but then there are things that he didn't answer. Now, another potential issue with this theory is that there were no records of a missing lifeboat. This could be explained away by the fact that the crew that found this boat didn't know to look for a lifeboat, but at the same time, if they expected foul play, you think they'd look for something like that. It's, just one of those things where we don't really have proper records of the people that found the Ourang Medan, so it's just left into theories. A couple of other smaller theories make their way onto this list. One of them being that pirates raided the ship and killed everyone on board. This one's a little tricky because there were minimal injuries on the outside of the bodies, and again, there was no record of anything major being stolen. I feel that if pirates had boarded and killed everyone and they had stolen things, they would have taken a significant amount of things to the point where the crew that found the ship would have noticed it. So the theory doesn't explain also why there was an explosion. It could have been a bomb because the pirates didn't want to leave any evidence. A lot of questions. What a surprise, I know. Connecting back to the theory of Jerry Rabbit, there is also a belief that the ship had been carrying dangerous chemicals, which caused chemical leaks. These chemicals will kill you if exposed long enough, but the sudden death of everyone would have only happened if there was a genuine massive leak, which, again, there really was no sign of. The chemical leak theory falls into the middle ground of the explosion, or at least explaining the explosion, because on one hand you have the material to cause it, but we don't know what caused the ignition. Perhaps there was a Silver Star crew member who was on the boat and they chucked a slightly lit cigarette butt. It could be a plethora of things of what started this explosion, because if you have this gas leaking into this ship, any sort of spark could set it off. Who knows? And of course, we have to include the supernatural possibility. Some people do say that this ship was haunted by ghosts. Others say it was an alien encounter. Of course, these two theories could explain every aspect. The only problem is that there's simply no evidence to support it. So until someone finds evidence, it's just going to stay a theory. The final theory that I wanted to share with you is what I think is the most interesting one, and that is that the Ourang Medan simply did not exist at all. That it was all made up. There are no official records of the ship ever existing. There are no ships under the name in the Lloyd's Shipping Registers, which is a registry established over 200 years before the Ourang Medan. Some claim that the ship didn't get its registry from the London-based one, and that the ship was actually registered in Sumatra. The name of the vessel translates to Man from Medan, or Our People in Medan, the Ourang Medan. Medan is a Sumatran island, explaining the origin there. I think that one's the most interesting because the further back in history you go, the easier it is to create a story and then just have that story build and build upon itself, even though the foundation of the story is completely wrong or just made up. And so we could be reading a story of total fiction. This could be completely made up for all we know. So with all of those theories presented, I'll just quickly throw in my thoughts and share with you what I think happened. So I actually, I kind of surprised myself reading all these theories. I'm leaning more towards the idea of Jerry Rabbit. Now, this theory does, of course, depend on if this person existed, but let's just assume he did. If he did exist, then pretty much everything else falls into place. It would explain the explosion because of the chemicals that were on the ship. It would explain why the crew could have potentially gotten sicker and sicker, and then they all died in a mass event. And that also includes the little to no external injuries. The ignition is kind of where I'm skeptical with this theory, because what exactly caused the explosion? But as I mentioned with the cigarette butt idea, this is kind of a smaller detail because there are a lot more things that could cause an explosion. But once again, that is kind of a hole in that theory. So once again, I'm kind of surprised myself that I followed that path, but it makes the most sense to me. So there you go. So with the Ourang Medan at the bottom of the sea and no one left to say what happened, the Nautic mystery will forever lay at the bottom of the ocean, waiting for some answers. And with that being said, thank you everyone for listening to today's episode. If you did enjoy it, please let me know in the comments what you thought about it. Let me know if there's any topics you want to hear in the future. Link in the description again to all of my social media platforms, especially you, people listening on YouTube. Make sure you like and subscribe and comment. We want that algorithm promoting this podcast, and we want to get a family together. We want to get a group. Thank you all again for all of your support. I'll see you in the next week episode as we talk about our first secret society. Take care, everyone.